Microsoft has made an incredible number of things in their 50-year history, enough that it's really easy to say that nobody knows the whole list. They've had their fingers in countless pies, and the annals of Microsoft products you never knew existed are extensive, to put it mildly. We could say the tip of the iceberg is Microsoft Bob, for instance. Further down, you've got Windows Blackcomb, Xenix, multitasking DOS, and somewhere well below the surface, you've got stuff like Windows Multipoint Server. A whole host of things that most people have never heard of, and that's just counting operating systems. There's countless forgotten applications, too, and even hardware products. There's the TV photo viewer, the original 2007 Surface, the Sidewinder gamepad with motion controls, and countless other things that made it to market but can easily be missed or forgotten. And then there's things that aren't deeper so much as they're on a completely different iceberg. And that's where we find Response Point, Microsoft's first attempt at a voice-over IP phone system. Okay, point of fact before we continue. The iceberg in question is labeled Microsoft Telephony Products, and it has plenty of company on there. There's Office Communication Server, which evolved into Link Server, then into Skype for Business, and eventually they dropped that code base and made a new thing called Teams. So that's at least 4 major products in their telephony portfolio besides this one. And each one of those, I should mention, was slower and clumsier than the last, with Teams being the crowning achievement. It's the worst and slowest telephony product I've ever used in my life, but I'm sure they'll eventually sunset that in favor of some new thing that's even slower, because while Microsoft has no idea how to do phones, companies keep giving them money to try, for no reason that I could tell you. But as far as I know, all those products were entirely software-based, they weren't completely about telephony, and they were all targeted at enterprises. This, on the other hand, is a Response Point PBX, and this is very obviously not an enterprise product. I doubt many corporations would buy a critically important device that looks like an Xbox 360. This is, to my knowledge, their only attempt at a consumer-grade, hardware-based PBX. Now, maybe that doesn't mean anything to you, and if so, good news. Kind of the point of this product is that it's for people who don't know what PBXs are. And it's pretty remarkable in that regard. I don't think I've seen anything else quite like it. But it is kind of hard to summarize what a PBX does concisely because they do so much. And I usually try to avoid getting into it for that reason. Now, the last time I said that, a bunch of people insisted that they wanted me to get into it. And I will eventually, but not in this video because it'd be 3 hours before we saw this thing actually running. I'll summarize it a bit later, but I'm here to talk about this thing, so let me show you what this thing does. This is a phone. This is another phone. And this is a network cable. All right, and here's what it all does.
It makes phone calls. That's what PBXs do. I mean, there's hundreds of other potential capabilities, but job one is just to connect calls between phones, either between extensions like this,
or to people from outside the office.
This is a voice over IP or VoIP PBX, which means that it doesn't use traditional phone lines, but I'm making this call from my actual cell phone. It's going to an ordinary phone number that's connected to an online gateway service that lets the call come in over an Ethernet cable, so I don't have to get an actual phone line delivered to my studio. It's very convenient.
And indeed, voice over IP is largely a product of convenience. Before VoIP entered the picture, big businesses had to pay for huge bundles of phone lines, or expensive digital phone trunks. But VoIP works over any ordinary internet connection, and you only have to pay for the gateway service, which is much cheaper than traditional telephony. And even if you're a small business that only needs a few lines, it simplifies things to combine your phone service with your broadband connection. Now, I'm talking about businesses here because they're nearly the only market for phone systems in the US. It's different in some other places. The German company AVM GmbH, there's got to be a way to pronounce that, but I don't know what it is, has sold about 1 billion home PBXs under their Fritzbox brand, and I assume they sell them in places other than Germany, but I don't really know. What I can say is that consumer PBXs are not a thing in the US. If an American home has a phone, it's a plain old telephone set plugged into a plain old jack, as it's always been. To the people watching who know the deep American ISDN lore, ISDN DNI. Oh, and Vonage doesn't count. That's just a simulation of a phone jack. The point is, most PBXs are intended for businesses. But even then, there's different types of business with very different needs. The phone systems used at a Wall Street trading firm are enormous, expensive, and incredibly powerful because they need to be. For many years, they were based on the same equipment used by actual phone companies, and in time, they exceeded what even those systems could do. But what Wall Street needs is very different from what a supermarket needs, or a factory, or a new car dealership, or a used car dealership, or a pharmacy in a small town in Kansas. These are all wildly different applications. But the industry has largely delivered just one product for decades, and it's basically just the thing they made for Wall Street. I did turn up in support for small and medium-sized business phone systems for over 10 years, and nearly all of their systems were virtually identical. Almost none of them used more than 3 or 4 basic features that were built into almost every PBX ever made. But despite this, the product we sold had hundreds of features, which very few of them ever understood, and they really just got in the way. It's never been easy to buy a PBX that was simple to configure. In fact, until recently, many companies had to retain full-time employees just to run the damn things. Back in the mid-'80s, for instance, popular systems like the AT&T Merlin could only be configured by sitting down at a telephone set and entering long strings of numbers blindly into an audio prompt. Later systems from companies like Nortel and Panasonic could be programmed through a terse menu on a 2-line LCD, or sometimes through a serial console, and that was better, but it was still nothing an end user could handle. And while the leading PBXs all got graphical, PC-based UIs in the 90s, they remained incredibly dense and inaccessible because they were just too complex. Even a low-end, small office unit like a Nortel BCM50, which is barely bigger than the phones it serves, is still modeled after the monstrous multi-cabinet systems that run tens of thousands of lines in skyscrapers. A very simple question like, how do I change this user's phone number, becomes a lot harder to answer in a system that supports features like least cost trunk routing. That feature is utterly irrelevant to any office with less than 1,000 employees, and most that do have that many. But the architecture that makes it possible forces every administrator to understand it even if they don't intend to use it. So configuring these things has always been hard. Besides that, the end user experience also has rough edges, which really never got polished off, even now. When I was working in the field, I never stopped getting calls from people who just couldn't seem to learn how to do basic things like transfer a call or even dial people by extension. And really, I don't blame them. If you're working at a job, actually working, doing stuff to advance the needs of the business. And one of the things you need to do is to call Bob's and Dougnet, your boss in the back office, translating that on the fly into, I need to dial 103 on my phone, is an abstraction that a lot of people just can't handle. Some folks are just bad at calling numbers, especially on top of whatever else they're busy with. So what do? You just look towards the back office and go, hey Bob, come out here for a second. That's not ideal. So wouldn't it be better if you could just say to your phone,
Call Bob's and Dougnet.
Bob's and Dougnet.
And it would just do it?
This is the dual thesis of ResponsePoint. It's a phone system that's easy to configure and easy to use. Something you could sell to the pharmacy in Kansas with 3 employees, and the guy who owns the place will run it himself. That's an underserved market, and providing for it is a brilliant idea, but it's kind of at odds with who was trying to do it.
ResponsePoint was made by an internal Microsoft skunkworks called the Speech Technology Group, headed up by one Zhuidong Huang. But there's almost more info to be found about that guy than the product. The guy seems to have a pretty big resume with regards to speech recognition, and I don't want to belittle any achievements there, but almost everything I can find about him or the Speech Technology Group reeks of bullshit. For instance, one of the first results you'll get on Google is an article for the IEEE called Creating a Startup Inside an Enterprise, which is 10,000 words of generic self-help crap that boils down to, if you want to get noticed and pad out your resume, find an executive and brown nose him until they let you spend a bunch of money on a whim. And that seems to have worked, but as with most business people and most ventures by business people, it feels like the product was just an excuse to start a business and not the other way around. Indeed, I found another article on this guy from Microsoft's own site, which is full of even more brainwormed nonsense. Act fast, ponder less, and learn, he says. Yeah, man, do you live, laugh, love too? It's gobbledygook. But if you read between the word salad, it seems clear what happened here. The object of this group was legit. They were put together to develop general purpose voice recognition software, but not any specific product. So once they had something that worked, they needed to find a product to put it in. And someone just came up with the idea of a phone system. They just brainstormed and, oh, why don't we do this? It was a means to an end, and that's concerning, especially given who we're talking about here. As I said, Microsoft keeps making phone systems, and every one of them is bad. I believe this is because only phone people understand phones. Computer people, programmers, always want to impose computer-esque workflows on them, and they confuse the hell out of users and admins alike. Sure enough, Microsoft does this. A lot. My job used to force me to use and administer Microsoft Teams, so I know both sides of it. I don't know which part I hate more. The app sucks, but the dashboard is incomprehensible. Very simple tasks take hours to complete, and it's because the people who made it have no experience with phones. They don't understand what admins need or how it should all fit together, and even once you find the settings you need, the system only promises that they'll take effect within 7 days. I shit you not. I don't know if I'll find this picture on Google Images, but this is a message that I got from Teams every time I changed something, and they weren't kidding. My changes never took effect in less than 24 hours, and sometimes it was longer. And this is what I expect from people who mostly work in cloud computing, masses of anonymous nodes that you never look at directly. And the only thing that matters is eventual consistency. If that's your wheelhouse, then you won't understand that when someone calls IT and asks to have their name changed, that needs to happen right away. That user can't have the wrong name showing up on other people's phones when they call them for a whole week. But Microsoft has always been more about submit a ticket than I'll get right on that. So the question is, were they able to think small enough to make this thing make sense? Let's find out. Now, first off, we need to get into it, but there's no real local interface to speak of. On the front, we have this little LCD screen, but it doesn't do much. It just shows you the current IP address. Fortunately, however, you don't even need that. All you need is a Windows PC. We'll use this one. To access this system, all you do is install the Microsoft Response Point Administrator. It automatically searches the network and finds any RP units you have, so you just select the one you want, put in your password, and just like that, you're in. Now, every other PBX that I'm familiar with requires you to manually punch in an IP address or connect to a serial port on the physical device or other things that are just completely out of the question for the guy running a small town pharmacy. So this system has already cleared a major hurdle by just letting the user get into it. So point to Microsoft. And once you're in, you get this very simple list of objects and tasks. And again, this is already a massive improvement over the typical PBX experience. See, the Nortel BCM management software looks like this. And the Avaya IP Office software looks like this. And the Samsung Office Serve software looks like this. So even as an expert on phones in general, you will have no idea where to begin with any of these. You simply have to be an expert to know anything at all. But in Response Point, it's hard not to know what you're doing. I mean, are you here to edit a user? You just click on the user. If you're here to edit a phone, you just click edit phone. Everything isn't buried 6 menus deep and named weird stuff like endpoints or subscribers. Conventional PBXs are so close to the telco gear that they originally descended from that they can't even commit to calling a user a user. Response Point, on the other hand, knows exactly where it's being used and who's using it and what things they're trying to do. So they call a user, a phone is a phone, a line is a line. It's all very straightforward. But what is a user and how is it separate from a phone and how is that separate from a line? I said I wouldn't get into it, but none of this will make any sense unless you have some grounding on what problem PBXs are meant to solve. So we need a crash course. Nowadays, we pretty much all have cell phones, right? But go back to the 80s or 90s, and obviously most people couldn't afford them yet. So you'll find that most folks back then just have a single phone line at home. Now that's inconvenient if your household has more than one occupant. If somebody's on the phone, nobody else can use it, right? Now most people just put up with that, but if you were rich, you'd often get 2 lines. Then 2 people could make calls at once. Duh. But I think that was probably it. I doubt that even the very rich bothered to get 3 or 4 lines, even if there were more people living in the house. You could, but I've never heard of anybody doing it. And I think it's just because statistically, it's not likely that 3 people are really going to need to be on the phone simultaneously. And it works pretty much the same way at businesses, even today. They make and receive a lot of calls, but it's rare for every employee of a business to be on the phone at once. If you're an insurance company with 100 employees, on average, maybe 20 will be on the phone at any given moment. Well, you don't need 100 phone lines then. You can do with a pool of 20, maybe 25 for a safety margin, and that's good enough. The trouble is, how do you connect 100 phones to only 25 lines? The math doesn't make sense. So enter the PBX, a little box that sits between your office phones and the outside world. You can think of a PBX sort of like a broadband router. You know how your ISP gives you a single IP address, but your router lets you plug in 50 devices and they can all use that one IP at once? It's the same thing. You can plug as little as one phone line into a PBX, then put as many phones behind it as you want. When someone wants to make a call, they just pick up their handset and the PBX connects it to that one shared line. Now, of course, phones aren't packet-based like internet connections, so the line will be tied up until that one call is over, but the PBX will make sure everyone knows the line is busy so you don't get any rude interruptions. So that's job one. Job two, of course, is handling incoming calls. Going with the router analogy again, maybe you know about network address translation, or NAT. If you don't, it's the magic that lets your PCs share one internet connection. But another thing that it offers, as much as NetSec people hate hearing this, is basic security. It blocks all unknown incoming traffic, such as botnets trying to hack your PC. Now, this isn't on purpose, of course, it's just a side effect, and it's because there's no rule for what to do with an unknown incoming packet, so it just gets thrown away. This is convenient on your home broadband router, but when you're talking about a phone system, you want random inbound connections to go somewhere so that customers can call you. So when a call comes in, the PBX needs to be told which of your 100 phones should receive it. Should it ring everybody in the office or a specific person? If it's after hours, should it go to a voicemail box or get forwarded to someone's cell phone? These and many other decisions have to be made by management, then implemented in the PBX. Now, once a call is in progress, you might need to change how it's set up, say by transferring it to a coworker. This is where users come in, or subscribers, or extensions, or seats, or a dozen other names depending on the system. Basically, every phone behind a PBX is usually bound to an identity of some kind. There'll be a user profile that has, at minimum, an extension, 3 or 4 digits that can be dialed like a phone number. So this guy here is 100, this guy here is 601, and this gives you an address to send transfers to, or to just call directly. This is one of the other important features of PBXs. If you want to call a coworker, you don't need to involve any outside phone lines. You just dial their extension and the PBX connects your two sets internally. In a company with thousands of employees, there might be hundreds of concurrent calls going on inside the office. And with a PBX, you don't pay a penny for any of it because you own all the infrastructure. Now, once again, with the router analogy though, an extension is like a local IP address. Your PCs can talk to each other within your network using their local IPs, but those addresses aren't valid in the greater internet. You only get one IP that other people in the world can reach. However, in your router, you can set up port forwards to allow inbound traffic from the outside world to reach those private IPs. And the same thing is true with PBXs. If you order multiple numbers from your phone service provider, your PBX can map those to specific extensions, so callers can reach specific people by dialing specific numbers. It's a feature called direct inward dialing. Okay, that was a lot of talking, and fortunately, that's it. Those are the absolute fundamentals, the capabilities that every PBX in existence offers, going back like 80 years, okay? These are the universal things. And after that, we get into features. Every business needs different sets of features. I mean, some need none, but many need lots. There are thousands of features. They differ wildly between systems. And even if two machines from different manufacturers have the same feature, they'll rarely call it by the same name. This starts out with things like music on hold, automatic call forwarding, voicemail. Then you escalate to directory services, interactive menus, voice recognition, fax to email, bulk dialing, just to name a few things. At the far end of the spectrum, you've got stuff like computer telephony integration, or CTI. Example, if you work in a modern call center, when your phone rings, the customer's account info will just pop up on your screen automatically. It's a thing called a screen pop. The PBX has a feature that sends the caller ID to your PC, and that looks it up in a database. Also, if you're at a grocery store and you hear an automated voice overhead say, "Call waiting for bakery department 202," that's a feature called Parkin' Page that I think was made pretty much exclusively for supermarkets and big box stores. And the list goes on and on and on. And of course, Like I said, most businesses don't need any of it, and it serves mostly just to confuse people. ResponsePoint pares away almost all of those confusing features. It has very little besides the fundamentals: phones, users, and lines. But those concepts exist on every PBX. The basics are universal, but they're usually mind-numbing to set up. If you have an Avaya or a Mitel or, God forbid, an Asterisk box, there's just no chance in hell of a non-expert figuring out where to begin. So let's pretend that we're a new admin who just got this out of the box, plugged it in, and knows nothing about it. I'm going to wipe this system, and we're going to take it from the top. Now, I think that even the total neophyte would start by setting up their connection to the outside world, and we do that by clicking Add Voice Service. Now, that's not quite as clear as one would hope. You'd think it would just say add outside lines, but since this is a voice over IP system, I think that's kind of iffy. Lines implies a finite set of channels, and that isn't necessarily applicable. I mean, it is if you actually do use physical phone lines, and to be fair, that is possible on this particular unit. See these jacks on the back of the PBX? I know I said this was a voice over IP system, and it is, but it has a built-in adapter that converts up to 4 analog phone lines into a VoIP format. It may seem kind of silly to get such a modern device and then hook it up to an ancient analog service, but in some places you just can't get reliable broadband, especially in 2007 when this first came out. So this was a must. And that module does show up as a set of individual lines in the UI here. But most people would probably get this for VoIP, I think, and those services can deliver an indefinite number of calls at once, basically as many as your internet connection can handle. Each individual VoIP call only uses about 150 kilobits in both directions, so if you have a 50 megabit service, that's about 300 concurrent calls if I did my math right. Now, many VoIP providers will charge you per session, so you might have to order just 20 or 30 channels ahead of time, but others just charge by the minute and allow as many concurrent calls as you can send them. So representing VoIP service as a pool of lines doesn't really make sense. Also, this thing probably scales quite a bit more than it seems at first. Microsoft's brochures for ResponsePoint say that it's intended for businesses with 50 employees or less, but there doesn't seem to be any actual hard limits on anything. Many PBXs do have limits based either on arbitrary license restraints or on hardware constraints, but this doesn't seem to have any. The help file mentions nothing about them, and it does say that you can connect as many phones as you like. They just recommend sticking to no more than 200 because it might bog down the CPU. But it sounds like you could blow way past 50 users and probably have everyone in a call simultaneously without much trouble. So yeah, they didn't really want to limit what this interface could display. Anyway, if we were using analog service, setting it up would be a matter of just plugging the cables in. But for VoIP, we have to set up an account with our provider. So we hit Add Voice Service and immediately get confused by this dialog. Not all ResponsePoint units were the same, a topic we'll get into later. This one does have the built-in analog ports, so those show up automatically, but many of these things only had an Ethernet jack, nothing else. So if you were forced to use analog lines or a T1 or PRI, which are special digital phone lines that are commonly used by businesses, there'd be nowhere to connect them on the unit itself. Microsoft's solution were adapters that would accept those services, convert them into voice over IP, and then plug into your network, and the base unit could discover them. Fortunately, we don't have any of those. We have VoIP, and the second one does say that, so we just pick that. Now, apparently, Microsoft ran a database of service provider data back in the day. You could pick like, 8x8 or Ring Central or whoever, and it would automatically put in all the proxy information and stuff like that. I don't want to get too deep into that, but it was probably a really bad idea, probably never worked very well. And in any case, the service is long gone, so we just have to go in here and pick other provider. And ResponsePoint gently suggests that we go look at a list of approved carriers before we proceed. Now, you might think this is just a co-branding opportunity, but the truth is, every PBX vendor has a list of providers that they know work with their gear, and often they have a list of providers they know won't. There are wildly different implementations of the common VoIP protocols, and in some cases, a given service literally cannot work with a given PBX. Case in point, I found a KB article from someone called OnSip that says you can use ResponsePoint with them, but they don't recommend it because your users will have to dial 4 zeros before every number. And I don't want to get into why this happens, it'll make both our brains hurt, but suffice to say, this kind of compatibility crap is commonplace in this industry. And things don't get much better on the next screen. That sure is a lot of fields with a lot of labels. Address of record, URI, auth ID, proxy address. These don't mean anything. Guess what? They hardly mean anything to me either. If you sign up with 6 different VoIP providers, you'll get 6 different sets of credentials, some with more fields than this, some with fewer, and they'll all have different names for every field. It's a notorious problem with voice over IP, and it's universal. So the only way out of this one is to hope that our provider's support staff can help us muddle through. Trust me, they spend half their day doing just that. So supposing we figure all that out, the next page wants to know about direct dial numbers. This is the thing I mentioned earlier. You can have specific numbers connect straight through to people's direct extensions. This is usually called direct inward dial. I guess Microsoft thought that one extra word was confusing. But in any case, we can't actually set this up without any users, so we'll just move on. Next, it asks what caller ID setting we want. Fun fact, did you know that an enormous number of phone service providers will let you send any caller ID that you like with no verification that you own that number? Just a fun little fact. Responsible providers, however, limit you to numbers you own, and in truth, the majority just ignore what you send and overwrite it with whatever the first number you ordered with them was. So most of the time you can just leave this empty, and that's what our provider will probably tell us when we call them in confusion. So we just hit next, we give it a name, and just like that, we have access to the outside world. Next, of course, we need some users, so we'll hit Add User. Now, most PBXs will offer you hundreds of settings at this stage. This one gives you 3. Name, extension, directory listing. The name is important because it appears on other people's phones when you call them, but also because it shows up in the company directory. We'll talk a bit more about that later, but suffice to say, it's a feature that lets callers hear an automated listing of all your employees and call anyone they like without needing to talk to a receptionist first. It's a neat feature. Some companies are going to want it, some won't, but even if you do want it, you might not want to put everyone in it. For instance, your CEO probably doesn't want random angry customers calling in and going, I could probably just say the guy's name here and then I get to yell at him directly. So there's an option to hide specific users from that directory, but still let people reach them if they know their name, and another to block those calls entirely. The last thing here is the extension number. Now, some systems will let you set longer extensions, but this one is limited to exactly 3 digits. Now, that's not a big deal. Obviously, you aren't going to put 1,000 users behind this thing. And shorter extensions, well, those would be convenient, but most systems won't allow them for complicated phone reasons. So this is pretty much par for the course. What's strange, though, is that once you've created a user, you can't change their extension. Now, it's not that common that you need to do that, it's just weird that you can't. On the other hand, though, PBXs often have a lot of loosely coupled moving parts inside, like the voicemail system will be an independent internal component, so this probably avoided a lot of coding effort to keep those parts synchronized. And indeed, the last setting here would be the password. That's for the voicemail system primarily, and every new user just gets it set to 9999. The first time they log in, it'll ask them to change it, which is the best way to do it because admins usually forget to write down whatever they put here. Now, speaking of voicemail, there's a tab for that, and there aren't a whole lot of options. Now, in a lot of older PBXs, voicemail was entirely optional, but for a small business, it's pretty much mandatory, so it's good that Microsoft built it in. This system is very simplistic, though. Every user gets voicemail by default, and I can't imagine why you'd bother turning it off, but I guess you could. And you can also leave the voicemail enabled, but not allow someone to listen to it through their phone. And I can't imagine why you'd do that either. In fact, I think this is such a weird option that nobody ever noticed that it doesn't work. I tried turning it off, but nothing happens. The final setting here, though, is to forward voicemails to an email address, and this is actually incredibly useful. This sends you a WAV file of every voicemail, so you can save that on your PC and have a permanent record of every message you've ever received. Also, if you have a company-wide voicemail box, you can have the messages emailed to everyone so people don't have to walk over to a single phone to check and see if there's a message waiting. You can even have it email multiple addresses. So this is actually a very well implemented feature. And of course, you can record a voicemail greeting, but we'll actually come back to that later. Finally, we've got the call handling tab, which opens with some esoteric options. This is actually a weird kind of privacy feature that seems to be unique to this PBX. See, a lot of phone systems offer a paging feature where you can call someone and their phone will just turn on its speaker so they can hear you, right? So I'd pick this up, I'd dial him, and this would just immediately go off hook, and I could go, hey, Steve, can you come over and grab the phone? I guess I don't exactly know what you use paging for instead of just calling someone, but it's in every single system. At any rate, Response Point enhances this with another feature called Intercom, which is the exact same thing, except it turns on the mic too. So I page you, your phone goes off hook, I can now talk at you, and I can hear whatever's going on in your office. Anything that's going on in your office at that moment. I'd love to demo these, but there'd be terrible feedback if I did. I'll probably punch something in here in a moment.
Hey, Steve, you got a call on line 2.
Obviously, there are privacy concerns with letting someone turn on a hot mic in your office remotely. So we have an option to turn that off entirely, and we have an option to leave it on, but to make it beep periodically. So, if somebody enables this while you're out of the office and then you walk in, you might be there for a few seconds before you realize it, but then it'll go beep and you'll go, hey, wait a minute, somebody's listening in on me. So those are good, except that they default to intercom on, warning beep off. And that may seem nuts, but remember, this is intended for tiny businesses, right? There's less concern than there would be in a huge company about like weird office politics and whatnot. Also, when you intercom, the phone plays a deafening chime that's pretty much impossible to miss. The other thing is that small business operators hate bumping into security checks that only make sense for huge companies. Everything their system can do, they want it to just be on and immediately usable and to not try and protect them from themselves. And honestly, that's usually the right choice. So I kind of think this is reasonable. Anyway, the final option here is call forwarding. If you don't pick up your call after a few rings, you can have it either go to your voicemail or go to another internal extension or get forwarded to an external number or just go nowhere at all. And that's it. We've created our user. That is every single user-specific option in the entire system. And I can't overstate how simplified this is. Compared to a Nortel or something, there's fewer options by orders of magnitude. I mean, just to pick one, in a real PBX, you need to choose which outside lines this user has access to. Response Point doesn't have that feature. A line is a line. It's first come, first serve. And that's probably the right call. The vast majority of businesses have no need for priority or cost-based trunk routing, and those options complicate the interface tremendously. But on the other hand, there's a lot of stuff missing here that would infuriate me. I can't override this user's outbound caller ID, for instance. There's no option to forward all calls preemptively before they ring, or to ignore calls from specific numbers, to ignore anonymous callers, to block international dialing. These are things that I depended on in my job every day. Like every single customer wanted to use these. But to be fair, I was mostly working with medium-sized businesses. When you have 100 employees or more, you can't know them all. You can't trust them all. One of them might come in and decide to use the office phone to call their boyfriend in Austria and run up a $50,000 bill that you have to pay for. But in a real mom and pop setting, if that happens, someone gets a spanking, A feed shop is too small for institutional style controls. Social controls are generally enough, and they typically don't get in your way as much. And we'll talk more about who exactly the target market for this was later, but let's just continue the tour for the moment. The one remaining basic element is the phones themselves. I've got these two phones hooked up, but you can see from the blinking light that they can't reach the PBX. It's because they're not configured. Once we've created a user, we have to assign a phone to it. And this is as simple as it could possibly be. We hit add phone. We tell it, yes, we plugged in the phone and powered it on. Believe me, you gotta force people to check that. And there we go. It detects the two phones on the network. So we just pick one and we tell it that we want this to have Steve as the primary user. We can give it a name if we want. It defaults to Steve Apple phone. And that's it. It's configuring the phone, and in a moment, boop, it's ready to use. I'll just run through that real quick for the other user here. And now our system is ready to use. I've just revealed that this phone handset is not plugged in. My movie magic is ruined. I have reasons for it, okay? I should point out that in a lot of lesser systems, even if the setup was that fast, you have to like reboot the phones a bunch of times to get them set up or swap between users or whatever. In this one, you don't. Everything is instantaneous. It's perfect. And at this point, we're pretty much done. Our phones have names and numbers, and
We can place calls, and if you're at least a little bit with it, this whole process from taking stuff out of the box to this point has taken less than 15 minutes. I can't say that that's faster than any other PBX I've ever used. That's probably an exaggeration, but it's pretty damn impressive for a machine you don't need to know anything to operate.
now, of course, we're not quite done. Next, we need to handle inbound calls. Although, if you're following the logical flow of the UI, you'll actually end up on the base unit tab next, so let's take a look at that. This is mostly maintenance features. You can see the event log, how much storage is available on the internal hard drive, set the base unit password, date and time. But you can also set up your email server for voicemail to email forwarding, and it's where you can set up your hold music. I mean, it says park music, and we'll come back to that later. It's a real topic, but it's basically hold music. Every company wants this. When you put a customer on hold, if there's just dead air, they'll hang up. So hold music's been mandatory ever since it was invented. By default, though, this just plays a built-in WAV file. And obviously, a lot of customers would want to change that, he says, knowing full well that most don't. Cisco Call Manager is sort of famous for this. It also comes with a default built-in WAV file, which virtually no customer bothers changing, and this is why almost every person on this planet has heard this piece of music. But an awful lot of people do want to change it. So it's unfortunate that this doesn't let you upload your own WAV file. You can either use the built-in music, or you can plug something into the input jack on the base station, a radio, a CD player, whatever. Not that that's legal. You're supposed to go pay Muzak for an actual licensed music on hold source, but nobody in the target demo of this thing would have bothered. Little secret for you, I've never heard of anyone bothering. So it's going to be a CD or a radio. But anyway, that's about it. So now we can move on to call routing. This page is where we would set up all of our inbound call routing. Normally that would be the next step in setting up a PBX. But what's most interesting about this one is we don't actually have to do that at all. So this phone here is on an external VoIP service. It's not connected to the response point network at all. It might as well be like a cell phone or something. So I'm just going to call the primary number on the response point here, which I did not memorize.
Thank you for calling. Please say the name of the person or group you would like to talk to.
Steve Apple.
Transferring to
Steve Apple.
Remember when I said this product was developed by the Speech Technologies Group? The technology in question was speech recognition. Out of the box, the response point has what's usually called an auto attendant, literally a computerized replacement for a phone attendant or receptionist. Any inbound calls to any number that goes to this system go to that auto attendant, and callers can just ask for whoever they want to talk to.
That's the company directory that I was talking about earlier. This is really remarkable. I think this might be the only PBX I've ever seen with a default inbound route. Most vendors are unwilling to make that many assumptions about how your system works. But of course, at most businesses, that's a perfectly safe thing to do. Most people who would install this would probably want exactly this behavior. So it's not just 15 minutes to get the phones basically working. It's 15 minutes to be genuinely ready to run your business. But of course, not everyone will want it to work exactly like this. That menu is very impersonal. So there are some settings here. On a real PBX, inbound call flows are incredibly convoluted. In some cases, they're almost Turing complete. But here, it boils down to one question. Who will answer calls? By default, everything goes to the auto attendant, although Microsoft calls that an automated receptionist. Again, probably the right call. But you can instead have calls go to an actual person or choose one or the other, the computer or the person, based on time of day. So you can go in here and set up your hours of operation for each day of the week, which days you're open. Then you can go in and add specific holidays to notch out of that as an override. It's actually quite well implemented. But one thing that is a bit odd here is if you go with the auto attendant approach, if somebody calls in and they either refuse to use the menu, so they just start hammering the 0 key, who hasn't been there, or if the system can't understand them, then you can pick a user to forward them to figure out what they want to do. And that's the operator. So you could choose an operator separately from a receptionist. And I'm trying to imagine what small business would have two different people for those functions. You'd think it would just go with the receptionist. Weird, but you can do it if you want. And that's it. Those are our options. This is a very simple way to look at inbound call handling. And for the most part, I like that simplicity. But it's also where we start to run into trouble because honestly, they've oversimplified here. Conventional systems have too many options. This has too few. For instance, a universal PBX feature is the ring group or hunt group. That allows you to add users to a list. Then when a call comes in, it'll ring the first person. And if they don't pick up, it rings the second and so on until someone answers. Or you could configure it to ring all users at once or do it based on who most recently got a call, many other algorithms. And if it rings for too long, you can usually have it go to like a common voicemail box, all sorts of things. But the point is, it's an extremely common desire that Response Point does not deliver in any way. Microsoft's only acknowledgement of this is a link here that says, how do I let multiple people answer incoming calls? And if you click this, it gives you actually quite a complicated process. When I first saw this, I'm like, wow, that's a lot of steps and a lot of bold text. So let me boil this down for you. What they want you to do is to come back here and add a new user. And up top, you should pick job role. Now, I skipped over this when we first looked at it because I have no idea what this means. A user could be a person, a group, a job role, or a location. What? I mean, I can vaguely understand what those might do. The trouble is, if I flip between them, I can't really see anything specific that it does do. It almost feels like it's only there to help people who can't grok the abstraction of a user can be either a specific person or a generic phone assigned to a particular purpose. Like a smoke screen just to make it make sense. But I don't think it actually does anything under the hood. So look, if I'm confused by this, that's not good news for Response Point. But anyway, we create our job role and we say it's, incoming users. And then we go to call routing and we set that job role as the default receptionist. And now we come back and we edit each of the phones for these users. And in the shared user field, we assign this job role we've created. Are you confused yet? Can we do this for the second one as well? Okay, and now it says it should work. So let's give it a shot. Okay, well, both phones are ringing and I can pick it up from either one. So that worked, right? Well, sort of. The trouble is, this isn't a real ring group. It's leveraging a feature that most systems called shared lines or bridged line appearances. Basically, you're just binding a second user to each phone as if that were their primary device. What does any of that mean? Don't worry about it. The point is, the reason this matters is because if we go to the call history here, it's actually quite a nice interface for viewing the call history, by the way. Many systems don't make it nearly this slick. Let's see who answered that call. This is my external phone, and it was answered by incoming users. Oh, wait a minute. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm full of shit. I was just about to tell you that there's no way to find out which user actually picked it up. It just says that group did. But actually, if you hover over it, it does say that it was answered on the phone called Bobson Dugnut phone, which is what I assigned to that user. So, okay, well, I look a little sillier than I expected right now, but the point is, this is a half-assed feature. This isn't how we do this, okay? Every PBX ever made has a ring group feature, but not this one. And even if the call history wasn't accurate, does that really matter? I mean, in a tiny business like the ones we're talking about here, you're not going to be doing this sort of forensic stuff, digging through the logs to figure out who made a call. But it's just the principle of the matter. And it's particularly confusing because it seems like it would be really easy to implement. Just make this a multi-choice list. It obviously supports delivering calls to multiple users at once. They just didn't put it in the UI, and that's a huge miss. And there's sort of problems with the underlying feature this is leveraging too. Let's go back to the phone wizard here. Okay, so we can bind up to 4 users to each physical phone. That's a very common feature. Like I said, it's bridged line appearances. And that's used for things like letting a secretary answer calls going to her boss, right? So we put him on the second line on this phone, and now if somebody calls Bob, Steve's phone rings. Now, if he knows Bob is there, he can just let it ring until he picks up, or if Bob has said, I don't want to be disturbed right now, then Steve can answer. And if the person actually has a legit reason to bother his boss, then he can pass it through to them. Great. This is an important feature, and Response Point technically supports it, but it doesn't support it very well. A typical voice over IP phone does support multiple identities. You can see here that I've got 2 phone lines assigned to this, Clive and Bob. And if I dial one of these, you can see that this line key is lit up, and it says the call was answered by Bob. So it's obvious who this call was intended for. But let's try this the other way around. I'm going to set up inbound calls so they all go to Bob. Then we'll just call the main number. Both phones ring, but there's no indication on the screen of who they were trying to reach. So if I'm Steve and I pick this up, I don't know that they were calling for Bob. So I'm going to say,
Hi, this is Steve.
and the caller is going to have to ask,
Why aren't you Bob?
It's awkward, particularly for internal calls, right? Even if I had a third phone here and I called Bob, it would ring on Steve's phone too. It's obviously undesired behavior, and there's no way around it. And the problems kind of continue to stack up as we go on here. For instance, suppose we do want to use that automated receptionist. Well, these are all the settings it has, and this is pathetic is the word. The only real choices we have are to disable the automated directory, so somebody who's calling in has to already have an extension, or they have to just hit 0 and talk to the human receptionist. And then we could turn on 3 questions. What are your hours? What is your location? And what is your fax number? That's it. Now, to their credit, the way that you configure these is extremely slick. Recording messages for auto attendants and like automated out-of-office messages and stuff like that is a huge hurdle for most users. But here, it's actually really straightforward. So if we hit the configure button for what are your hours, we have the option to manually upload a file to the base unit. Users don't understand that workflow. You can explain it any way you like, and they just won't get it. You'll have to do it for them. But check this out. Let's hit record new. Okay, it asks us to pick a phone. Let's pick Steve's phone, and then we'll just hit record, and we get a call.
At the beep, please record your prompt. When you are finished, click the button labeled Stop on the screen of your computer.
We are located in the bowels of hell, just past the 8th circle turnoff next to the lake of flaming blood. Now, there are PBXs that can call your phone to have you record a message like this, but the ones I've seen force you to use this awkward touch-tone interface to handle it. So yes, it calls you. Yes, it starts recording. But when you're done, you have to hit pound. And if you want to hear what you just recorded, you have to hit star. Users hate this, right? But here, if we want to hear what we just recorded,
We are located in the bowels of hell, just past the 8th circle turnoff next to the lake of flaming blood.
we just hit play on the PC. And if we want to re-record it, we hit record. If we like it, we hit OK. And that's it. This process works so well and is so intuitive that even if you're utterly clueless, you could just bang through these in no time at all. Let's do the greeting.
Thanks for calling Microsoft Response Point, where our response always gets to the point. If you know the party you'd like to reach, just say their name. Otherwise, say operator.
All right, that's most of them. And finally, let's do the hours of operation.
Oh, we're always open.
All right, that's it. All my messages have been recorded, and that took me like 2 minutes. It's fantastic. This is a terrific workflow. Every system should use this, and it even applies to voicemail. Like, suppose I'm the boss or whatever, and one of my employees says, hey, I need to re-record my voicemail greeting. I can't figure it out. I can just go in here to that user, hit specify, and send a call to their phone.
At the beep, please record.
Of course, now that I think about it, I would have to hit stop for them. Oh, that doesn't work as well as I thought it would. Well, okay, the point is, this system definitely has some innovations and even some brilliant ideas in it, but you've pretty much seen everything at this point, and it's missing a whole bunch of fundamentals. So for instance, this is all you can configure in the auto attendant. You can't define any custom menu options, and there's only one menu, this one. If you want a choice for Spanish-speaking callers, you're out of luck. If you want a choice for what's your website and email address, you're out of luck. And if you want to define a whole bunch of options that actually go to the same place, you're out of luck. And that sounds silly, but a lot of businesses want to have like sales, support, billing, etc., and they all actually go to the same person. It just makes them look bigger than they actually are. It's a common desire, and this system can't do it. On top of that, ResponsePoint's designers were so hyped about their voice recognition that there's no option for touch tones. You can't set these to option 1, option 2, etc. So if your caller can't speak clear English, their only choice is to say things the system doesn't recognize over and over until it punts them to the operator, assuming you even set one up. This is pretty weak stuff. But again, I do have to give them credit for the voice recognition because it's surprisingly good for its era. I kept using the name Bobson Dugnut earlier. That is actually what I set this phone to. Now that's a pretty weird name. I got it from a silly Super Nintendo game with a very poor translation. But
If you know the party you'd like to reach, just say their name. Otherwise, say operator. Bobson Dugnut.
Transferring to
Bobson Dugnut.
The system can, in fact, handle that, which is pretty impressive.
here's the thing though. Let's call in again. Bob.
transferring to
Bobson Dugnut.
You got it that time. God damn it. I tested that a dozen times at home and it never got it. I was gonna tell you that the speech recognition might be pretty good, but it doesn't understand abbreviations or nicknames. And so if you do have somebody with an odd name, you have to come in here and give them a nickname so that it can match to that. But I guess I was just slurring my words because I just tried it like 3 times and it worked every time. So yeah, okay, I gotta give him even more props than I intended. Now, of course, that is a pretty common abbreviation for a common American name, but shockingly, or perhaps not so much, this system actually does pretty well with non-Western names. But I think we can guess why that is.
Otherwise, say operator. Zhuidong Huang.
transferring to
Zhuidong Huang.
Yeah, so is it any surprise that the project lead made sure that this system could handle his name? Probably not so much, but still, gotta give him props for it.
So, while this is pretty impressive for a cheap PBX from 2007, none of that was actually the product's focus, apparently. The bulk of the natural language features are not aimed at external callers. They're actually intended for internal users. So, we need to take a look at that. A huge focus in the design of the ResponsePoint system was this huge blue button here. This is sort of like the start button for ResponsePoint. So if I hit this, I get a prompt. Call Bob.
Bobson Dugnut.
And it calls Bob. Or how about this one? I'll call in from outside. Okay, so Steve answers, and now he wants to send this call over to Bob, so
call 1 parked.
transfer to Bob.
Bobson Dugnut.
Transferring. You may now hang up.
Slick, right? I could also do this.
Call 1 parked.
Transfer to Bob's voicemail.
Voicemail for
Bobson Dugnut.
transferring. You may now hang up.
And of course, if I'm not on a call, I could ask to intercom or page him. Page Bob.
Oh, this will have a lot of feedback. Whoa.
Okay, that was a bad idea. Now, there are buttons on my phone to do some of these things. I think that's last call return. That's my call history. That's a conference. This is transfer, I believe. But there isn't one on here for page or intercom. Certainly not one for transfer to voicemail. And the point is that the voice feature means I don't need to remember which of these esoteric icons represents what. And I also don't need to remember his extension number. So for someone who's bad with this sort of thing, it's a fantastic feature, at least in concept. But at this point, we run into more problems, and this time they aren't nitpicks. As I said, Response Point has some neat features, but it struggles with fundamentals. So, for instance, let's call in again.
Okay, so we're on our call and we're talking, and now I need to step away from the phone and do something. So I'm going to put you on hold.
All right, the hold button lights up, and I'm going to go in the back room and just do some stuff. I'm in the back room right now. All right, I've had you on hold for about 2 minutes, 50 seconds or so any moment now. That happens. My phone starts ringing to remind me that I have a call on hold. This is a great feature. Most PBXs have it. It's called hold reminder, hold recall, something like that. But let's let this ring for about a minute or so, because I'm not here. I'm in the back room checking on something. So it just keeps ringing. It's been about 45, 55 seconds. All right, there we go. And it quits ringing. That's pretty typical. You don't want your phone just ring continuously, for the whole 20 minutes you're in the back room or whatever. So hold reminder usually just rings for a minute or so, and then it stops, and after another 5 minutes or so, it starts ringing again. But there's a problem here, because my phone kind of doesn't seem to have a held call anymore, and my Polycom doesn't show a call in progress because it just hung up on me. Okay. So this is a very common failure mode for misconfigured voice over IP systems. It happens all the time when you have your network set up wrong, but that's not what's going on here, because this is actually by design. The help file says outright that it's supposed to work like this. And with that, Response Point goes in the garbage. Full stop, no discussion, it's over. There is no valid use for this system. Do you remember the part earlier where I said that programmers can't make phone systems? This is what I was talking about. You can imagine justifications that they came up with for this behavior, but they're all wrong. They're all bullshit. In the real world, people who actually have to use phones for their job know that holds can last 15 minutes, 30 minutes, longer. If you're a warehouse worker who has to go move a bunch of crates to figure out if something's in stock, you just got to leave the caller on hold for as long as it takes. And 3 minutes isn't enough. It can't be adjusted, at least not that I could find. The help file didn't say anything about it. But even if it could, this feature shouldn't exist. There is no purpose for it. There's no PBX crime, no phone sin more cardinal than dropping a held call. This is a never event. This cannot be permitted. If you are a phone system vendor and your system does this, your customer will call you and say they're dropping you or suing you unless you can fix it in less than 24 hours. Now, there's several reasons that this is so dire, and the first one is that all customers everywhere forever believe that a person they're talking to on the phone is a victim who has been trapped on a call with them and will thus weasel their way out by any means necessary. Customers hate being put on hold because they believe that is just a means to justify hanging up on them. And if this actually happens, there is no force on earth that will convince them it was an accident. And they will go on to repeat this tale of woe to anyone who will listen, and in every online review space that they can find for years. This is devastating to a business's reputation. You cannot drop calls. Beyond how immensely rude it is, if someone gets disconnected, they then have to work their way back to you. If they called in through a receptionist or a hunt group, they may have been dropped on you randomly and they won't necessarily know your name. On top of that, at a lot of places, employees aren't supposed to blindly transfer calls to other people, even if you do know their name. So it might take half an hour for you to get back in touch. It might be impossible. I will stake my name on the promise that no PBX in history has this option because it's gibberish. I mean, There are many options for held calls. Some systems will let you redirect calls that are on hold for too long to an inbound call queue, for instance. Great feature. But no PBX designer would add an option that just drops the call. It's incomprehensible. Why would you do this? I would ask, what's wrong with them? Why would someone do this? But I already know the answer. It's because Response Point wasn't made by PBX people. It was made by programmers. And worse, programmers working at Microsoft in the mid-2000s, one of the most cloistered environments imaginable. I think it's safe to say that most programmers, statistically speaking, have never held jobs outside of offices, except maybe briefly as teenagers. So they don't use phones that often, and not even as much as other people in the same building, like sales or customer support. So when a programmer attempts to design a phone system, something which happens depressingly often, the resulting mess is, at best, fit to the needs of someone who works in an office and only uses the phone to briefly get in touch with people to make plans or make brief requests or to join conference calls they don't want to be on. That's it. That person, and I'm sorry if this is you, but I'm just saying, you can't, from that perspective, understand the vastly different needs of a call center agent. And you certainly won't understand the guy who owns a pharmacy in Kansas. And that's not a flippant example, okay? It's not a joke. I keep saying that because in my career, I kept working with these people. I talked to at least 40 mom and pop pharmacies. So they're pretty much my model for a true small business. And for that purpose, this system is utterly unacceptable. If you're running an independent drugstore, here's what you want to happen when someone calls your published number. All the phones in the building ring until someone picks up, except maybe the one back in the manager's office. Now, you might want the call to get forwarded to voicemail if nobody answers after a while, but a lot of the time you just want it to ring indefinitely. Now, that call will get answered eventually by whoever's nearest the phone. Maybe that's the pharmacist, maybe it's a stock boy, who knows. Whatever the caller wants, a prescription, a stock check, whatever, whoever grabbed it has to deal with it. So if that person's at the front counter and they need to go to the back room to answer their question, they need to be able to look at the phone and see that their call came in on line 2. There'll be a little yellow light on next to a button labeled line 2. So they hit hold and that light starts blinking. The employee now deals with 1 or 2 other customers waiting in line, and then when they're ready, they walk to the back room, they find out whatever they need to find out, then they pick up the nearest phone, whichever one it is, and they press line 2 to retrieve their call. They give the answer, and if the caller now needs to talk to someone else, they're going to hit hold again, and then turn and yell, "Bob, pick up line 2!" This is how things have worked at small retail businesses, at warehouses, at factories, and countless other places for decades, partly because it has very good ergonomics. This fits the needs of a small business really well, and it's very easy to learn. But also largely because it's how the AT&T 1A and 1A2 key systems worked in the 1940s and 60s respectively. Those things were incredibly popular, so decades of PBXs have had the option to mimic them, and that's kept the technique in cultural circulation. Even most voice-over IP PBXs are capable of simulating a fixed pool of outside lines, so you can do this hold and retrieve thing, even if it's a total fiction. It fits this workflow, so you have to be able to do it. This phone right here can do that. Response Point can't. And that's a crucial miss, in my opinion. The most underserved businesses in this space are tiny establishments that are open to the public. And I think Microsoft should have focused on those, but they didn't. And I'm not surprised because, again, only a tiny percentage of programmers have ever worked retail. And those who have usually think of it as a cesspit that they escaped as a natural part of growing up, rather than a massive industry full of people with needs that aren't being met. But what else is new? I'm not the first person to say that software companies are ivory towers. At any rate, this system is totally useless for that kind of venue. It would admittedly work fairly well at a law office, for instance, an insurance office, that sort of thing, where everyone sits at the same desk every day, where most callers are trying to reach one particular person, most calls never get transferred, and if a call drops, both parties can usually get back in touch quickly, and they probably have a good rapport. There's no suspicion, no distrust, and that is a market, to be sure. I worked with plenty of businesses like that, but I think most of those places have the budget to hire a phone tech, at least as a consultant, to get it set up. And they're way too busy actually working, if you will, to wear another hat like that. They're also frequently staffed by people who do not like adapting to new ideas. You cannot get a lawyer to configure a phone for love or money, let me tell you. So the one niche where Response Point could work isn't one where it could thrive. And I question whether it could even function there, to be honest. The inability to place calls on hold for long periods is an incomprehensible limitation, even for a lawyer. 3 minutes isn't enough for any employee of any business, and mandatory recall isn't acceptable. Most people hate that feature and will turn it off if they have the choice. And what's even worse is that the Response Point manual is both misleading and kind of smug about this. The manual says that holds time out after 2 minutes, which is wrong. It's actually 4. So I'm guessing that they got mass complaints and their solution was just bump the timer up by 1 minute. Yeah, that'll fix it. So anyway, they forgot to update the docs, whatever. But it goes on to say, in typical programmer talking down to you in a bug report fashion, that your real problem is that you shouldn't have wanted to do that. You should have used a park instead. Okay, so most PBXs have a feature called parking, and it's kind of like an enhanced hold. It's like this. I'm gonna call in again.
So my call is in progress. Now, if I hit the big blue button,
Call 1 parked.
It's now parked. So my phone is completely idle. I could place another call if I wanted, etc. Or I could go over to another phone, retrieve call,
Retrieving call 1.
and pull the call over to this set. So that means I can go to any phone in the office and pick up where I left off without needing to send the call there with a transfer. This is a great feature. Every system should have it. Most do. And I suspect that the developers thought this solved the problem, even for Pop's Pharmacy. You know, who needs line keys? Just go to the back and retrieve the call from the park. Okay, so people who are not computer people don't get abstract concepts like this. And I hate to speak in generalities, but I've been around the block and I can tell you that the fundamental unifying quality of every complaint by every nerd about normies or losers going back decades comes down to one fact. Many people do not grok concepts that have no tangible form. You and I, being computer nerds, easily conceive that a computer, which of course a VoIP phone or a PBX is, contain invisible logical spaces in which information and virtual objects can be stored and retrieved. And we model these spaces in our heads. We mirror the computer's internal state, and that allows us to plan our interactions with it. What I'm saying is that observationally, I can tell you that non-nerds are not used to this style of thinking, and it's very hard to get the manager of a feed store to play ball with it. When they put a call on hold and a button starts blinking, that's physical, tangible, material. It's effortless to understand. When you have them park a call, it disappears into this intangible, imaginary slot, and you're asking them to imagine that virtual parking place in their head and then retrieve their call from it with arbitrary, unrelated actions, and they won't do it. Just trust me, they never will. They're just too busy doing their jobs to remember all this silly bullshit. I mean, this is actually better than most systems. On a typical PBX, you park a call by hitting a park button if you're lucky, but often you have to wait for the system to tell you which slot it parked it in, and then you retrieve it by dialing some insufferable key sequence like *81 followed by the slot number. So the owner of the pharmacy is standing at the counter. He's got 6 different prescriptions rattling around in his head. There's 8 customers in line. One's on their cell phone yelling at their doctor's office. There's a baby screaming. There's 2 calls on hold. And you want them to hear George pick up Park 2 and convert that into lift the phone and dial *812#. No, they're not doing it. You wouldn't even want to do that. Then you add in the response point philosophy, and now you've got this 65-year-old pharmacist with his hand cupped around the handset, mumbling as loudly as he can,
Retrieve Park 2. Cancel. Retrieve Park 2.
Voicemail.
It's just not happening. And yet, Response Point thinks this is the only way you should put anyone on hold. Remember that earlier I said there's a setting for park music, but no hold music? That's right. I don't know if you noticed earlier, but when I put this phone on hold, it was just dead silence. Oh boy, no other PBX does this, and I have no idea what they were thinking. It seems almost punitive. Oh, you're not going to use our parks that we're so proud of? Fine then. Enjoy your broken garbage feature, loser. The real irony of all this is that the documentation implies that parks solve the timeout problem. They don't. The timer's still there. It still recalls after 3 minutes, except now, if you don't pick up after your phone's been ringing for a minute, which, by the way, the customer can hear on their end. They're just sitting there listening to hold music, and suddenly they hear ring back. So they know something's wrong. Once it runs out of recall time, it then follows your user's no answer setting. So instead of hanging up, it dumps them to your voicemail. This is worse than dropping the call because the customer can absolutely tell that they just got mishandled. It is incredibly embarrassing. And Response Point is full of issues like this, where they obviously either didn't know what they should have been aiming for, or they tried to aim simpler and went too far. The whole business, for instance, with assigning multiple users to one phone, that's a great feature when it works correctly. But the fact that these phones don't have line keys renders it counterproductive at best. Now, in a real PBX, there are multiple features that would have been better fits for these specific telephone sets. But I'd guess that Microsoft's designers, not knowing how users work, thought they were picking the simpler option, not realizing it was actually more confusing. So, okay. I'd like to move on to a big conclusion, but I'd be remiss in not mentioning the final component of this system. I couldn't figure out where else to put it in the script, so we're just going to do it now. Besides the administrator, there's a second piece of software you can install called the Response Point Assistant. Now, most modern PBXs have something like this, and it's a kind of computer telephony integration, though not nearly as advanced as the call center screen pop I mentioned earlier. Any user can use this. You just put in your extension, put in your password. It auto-discovers the base station, fortunately. And then we get a list of all the users on the system. So this is a presence dialog, which means that it shows you whether people are on a call or not. So Steve answers a call and he turns red in the list. Now, I tried this out earlier and I had to change which user I was logged into, and I'll show you why. Let's log out, then log back in as Steve. So now we can see the status of Bob's phone and the incoming user's job role that I created earlier when we were messing with inbound calls. Watch this.
Transferring to
Box and Degnut.
All right, so Bob answers the phone, and both him and the incoming user's job role turn red. Because even though incoming users didn't answer the call, a phone to which that user is assigned is busy. Oh, this is so broken. I don't have words. This means that if Steve was monitoring Bob's line, because he's the boss and he's the secretary, if Steve answers a call, Bob's phone will look like it's busy to everybody else in the company. This doesn't work. This is just fundamentally broken. But whatever, let's press on. So besides seeing everybody's presence, you can also double-click on any user to call them. And that automatically picks up on the speakerphone, dials the number, and then you can pick up the handset if you want. This is a nice feature, and I can't prove this, but I would guess that this also has a plugin for handling tel URLs. And what that means is if you're on a website in your browser and you see a phone number, usually it will become a clickable link, and if you click on it, this app will forward it to your phone, so you don't have to go manually dial it. Nice feature, and since Microsoft added those APIs to Windows in like 1995, I'd be shocked if this didn't have it. We can also add custom contacts to this. You can see I've added my external VoIP phone here, so if I double click that, it calls it directly. Terrific. So far this is nice, but one curious thing is there's no field to just dial a number directly in the app. I mean, most of these programs have that, so you can just dial a number on your keyboard and hit enter. They have to be added as a contact for that to work. That's a weird limitation if you ask me. But what's even weirder is that there's no voicemail implementation. I mean, there's an option here to call voicemail, but all that does...
Welcome to voicemail. Please enter your password. To check voicemail for a different extension, press star.
...is make your phone call voicemail, the same as if you pressed the button on the phone. And that means you're going to have to use the miserable touch tone interface. Press 7 to delete a message, press 9 to keep a message. Users hate voicemail, and this was a golden opportunity to improve that process. Remember earlier when I showed you how you could record messages using the software on your PC in conjunction with your phone? That would have been amazing for voicemail. I mean, being able to play or download messages on your PC would be fantastic. Being able to delete them en masse would be amazing, but just a set of buttons for save message, next message, previous message, that alone would have made voicemail far more tolerable. They missed every ramp off this freeway. It's like an inverse hat trick. Now, on the flip side, sort of, it does improve the call park process. So let's talk more about how much that sucks. Let me put another call on park. Okay, so I parked a call on this phone. You can't tell, right? There's no indication that there was ever a call on this phone. The only way to find out is to press the big blue button.
Call 1 parked.
And that gives you a reminder that there's a call parked. But if I do it on this phone, there's no such reminder. So if Steve stacks up 8 parked calls, even though they could be retrieved by anybody else in the company, there's no way for anyone else to tell that they exist. He would have to tell them, I have a park in slot 7, because there's 8 park slots in this machine, and then they can pick up their phone and say, retrieve slot 7, but they have to know it's there. They have no idea who's parked. There's no way to find out the details of those calls. And for that matter, when someone parks a call,
Call 1 parked.
it just tells them call 1, call 2, call 3, parked, and they just have to remember which one it was. You can obviously lose track. So in the Assistant app, if we go to parked calls, this shows every park in the system. And if you hover over them, it says who parked it and when the call came in. And if you click it, it will retrieve it to your phone. This makes it a lot easier to not lose a call. On the other hand, you can't park an ongoing call from the window, so you have to do it from the phone. And I didn't mention this yet, but the phone interface is kind of broken. You may have noticed that I'm not pressing a special park button. I'm just hitting the big blue button. It just parks any call you have in progress automatically, whether you want it or not. So that kind of sucks. But pay attention to this.
Call 1 parked.
Retrieve call.
Retrieving call 1.
Okay, retrieving call 1. Hey, how's it going? Oh, I see. It didn't actually connect the call to my phone. It's actually ringing right now, and if I hang up, that ring comes through. This is the call that was just retrieved. You have to hang up and then pick up again to actually answer it. It doesn't automatically end the... I can feel the vein in my brain about to burst. And on top of that, and this is the wild thing, we park a call, then we retrieve it from the app.
Retrieving call 1.
This too leaves us connected to a dead call with the voice system, and we have to hang up and pick up again to actually answer the call. What? This is just unfinished. How did they sell this? So at this point, you could tell I'm giving this thing a 0-star review, but we do have to just finish the last little bit because there's still actually one more horrible feature. First, however, a good one. If we go to the settings menu and we go to identification, this is the only system I've ever seen that actually solves for this problem. A user can edit their own contact details. Now, obviously, in a large business, this would be absolutely out of the question. It's a massive security risk, and it makes sense that most systems would just not promise this so that they don't have to explain why they're blocking everyone from using it. Because obviously you don't want to hire some nobody who, comes in, sits down on the first day, finds out they can do this and just changes their name to the CEO of the company and then starts calling random extensions and telling people to buy gift cards. But at a small business, if there's 2 people in an elevator and someone farts, everybody knows who did it, right? So there's not much risk of someone masquerading as another employee. On the other hand, when the receptionist gets married, she doesn't need to wait for her name to get updated for 6 weeks because the boss is out of town. He's the only one who has an admin login. She can just do it herself. So this is a great feature. The other two tabs here are just the same ones that we saw in the admin panel, so users can basically control all of their own settings. That is probably a good thing. There's also a new tab for notifications. So if I make an inbound call, you see there's this little, people call it a toast now, that tells me there's an inbound call. However, I can't answer it. You'd think I could just tell it to make my phone pick up on the speaker, but I can't. And if I hit the X here, it doesn't actually drop the call, it just hides it. So it's kind of useless. But if you don't like it, you can at least turn it off. And then finally, we've got the contact page. So this is where you could put in all your users. So you could do click to dial. And that in itself would be fine. In fact, it's a pretty well implemented feature. It allows you to have a name and then 3 different numbers. You can actually set it up so that if you do have multiple voice services like analog lines plus VoIP trunks, or like one VoIP service for local calls and one for international, you could actually set it up to use one particular service for this specific contact, which, hey, I mean, at least they have some way of doing that. And you can add 1,100 contacts per user. So this seems great. But there's a feature here which I have to call a miss feature. It's called Bypass Receptionist, and here's what it does. Suppose that Bob, the CEO, doesn't want all of his friends and associates to have to wait for the automated receptionist to transfer them every time they call in, especially because his user is hidden in the public directory, so they'll have to talk to the real receptionist every single time. Well, he can add all those people to this list and enable the Bypass Receptionist feature. And now, when they call in,
Transferring to
Box and Degnut.
they just get passed through straight to his phone. Fantastic. Nobody has to pass go. Except this works whether Bob is in the office or not. Many PBX systems have a do not disturb feature that a user can set on their phone, or they can enable call forwarding and many other things to handle being out of the office for an extended period. But this system doesn't. So Bob leaves on vacation, locks his office door, and now every single person that he knows is unable to reach the business at all because they call the main number or any of the other numbers and they just get his voicemail every time. So nobody else even knows that they're trying to call. Agonizing. And there are workarounds. You can go into the admin panel and you can disable receptionist bypass, but you can't do it on a per entry basis. So you have to turn it off for the entire company at once. There's no way for the admin to go into a specific user and remove those entries. So they would have to go in, reset their password, log in through the assistant app, and then uncheck all those entries themselves. And then when Bob gets back, he has to go turn them all back on. The aneurysm, I can feel it. It's happening. This is an attractive nuisance. It seems like a neat feature, but the real solution is direct inward dials so that Bob can have a direct number to give to all his friends and then another one that calls the front desk. Now, of course, you can't always have that if you just have analog lines or you don't know how to set up a direct inward dial, but this is just a case where you just need to do it correctly because doing it this way is a bad idea. I could continue complaining and inventing stories about why this thing sucked, but really the proof's in the pudding. Response Point was never a major player, and when Microsoft discontinued it just 3 years later, the articles all basically said, yeah, it's about time. I doubt many end users loved this, and I'm sure PBX techs hated it. They did sell a bunch, though. I found this one at RePC, our local e-waste store. It just showed up one week. And the phones were also there, except they'd been sitting on a shelf for 5 years. So they must have sold if people are still throwing them out. There's also several units on eBay, so none of these are unobtainium, but on the other hand, they're rare enough that nobody has archived any of the software. That made it incredibly difficult to get this working, let me tell you. This thing is totally useless without the administrator software. There's no local interface, no web UI, nothing. If you lose the program, you're just screwed. You can't operate it. And the only place it was ever distributed was on the original CD-ROM that came with the device, which of course, nobody kept. On the other hand, Microsoft did release 2 service packs, and after several days of searching, I managed to turn up the SP2 installer on an FTP run by D-Link's Australian division. I'm guessing nobody else bothered mirroring it because Microsoft hosted it on their site for free. Who would pay for the bandwidth if they could just link to Microsoft's extremely fast site? On the other hand, Microsoft probably didn't have an Australian mirror, so D-Link had to host it locally for their customers to get tolerable speeds. So, okay. Of course, even after I got that, I then discovered the software on the PBX was newer than the pack I downloaded, and there's no way to downgrade it or to find the later software, and you can't use an older version of the admin app with a newer version of the software. So I had to disassemble the PBX, I had to pull the hard drive out, I had to figure out how to inject the older version of the software, which is all very fun stuff, but hang on, let's go back a sec. D-Link, what are they doing here? Wasn't this a Microsoft product? Well, this is where shit really gets absurd. Microsoft never built a response point PBX. Despite this godforsaken thing looking like an Xbox 360 prototype, they had nothing to do with its creation. This thing was actually made under the Syspine brand. I have no idea what that word means, and it only exists on paper anyway. It's actually a submark of Quanta, makers of a vast range of computing products, including my home NAS. But there were also units made by AAstra and D-Link, and initially Uniden was even going to get in on the fun, but that fell through for some reason. And I don't have the D-Link unit, but I do have an AAstra, thanks to a viewer. Shout outs to Matt, thank you for sending this over. And I have a D-Link phone, so I can show you a few of the differences. If you're curious, the phones are, of course, completely intercompatible. So you can use any phone, D-Link, Syspine, AAstra, whatever, with any of the response point base units. And frankly, I have no doubt that any of these were designed for this system. They're probably just phones these companies were already selling that just got new firmware. That's usually how it goes in this market. In addition, I know for a fact that when Response Point collapsed, AAstra published firmware to convert all their phones into generic SIP devices, so I suspect I have some of the only working Response Point desk sets left in the world. They all have basically the same features, but not the same layout at all. For instance, the Syspine uses these inscrutable icons, while the D-Link uses actual text labels, which have their pros and cons, but I can never remember what the hell any of these mean, so you know what my opinion is on the matter. The D-Link also has a built-in menu. This thing doesn't have any configuration menu whatsoever. But this isn't necessarily a good thing because this has a whole bunch of options in here. Like, for instance, call forwarding when you're busy or at all times, or if you don't answer after several rings, anonymous call rejection. None of this works. There's no features for this in Response Point, so these just don't do anything. That makes me think that this was intended for another system and they just put in a very minimal effort to convert it. Again, very common. The biggest difference, though, is the big blue button, or lack thereof. The Microsoft folks made a big deal out of this in the concept of the system. They called it a cornerstone of the design, but D-Link either didn't get the message or didn't care. Their teal button here looks like just some generic feature access key that they repurposed. On the other hand, though, they had another model, the DPH-128MS, on which the RP button was blue, so what do I know? It's still not any bigger, though, and there's problems with the manual. For instance, it claims the phone has functioning line keys. Now, that would be a great improvement if you could actually bind each user to a separate physical key. But I don't think those actually work. It's pretty obvious this manual isn't for this phone. Response Point is mentioned on the first couple pages, and there's a couple pages that show how to add the phone to the system, and then the rest of it is all clearly generic documentation. It all refers to the SIP server instead of mentioning Response Point ever again. They also talk about tons and tons of settings that would never work on this system. And in fact, that whole section, like page 20 out of 200, starts out with a warning to not change any of this stuff because it'll break Response Point. That's how little effort D-Link put into this product. If they'd been awake enough to even realize what they were selling, they would have removed all of this documentation and disabled most of the menus. Response Point phones are supposed to be centrally configured, so all this is unnecessary nonsense, but D-Link didn't care because they were sleepwalking, and who can blame them? Microsoft made a hash of this entire product, and it's because they didn't take the reins in any way. They didn't bother making anything themselves, they just partnered with other companies. But It was just whoever would have them. They didn't go out and select existing industry juggernauts or up-and-comers. They just offered this to whoever felt like throwing a few bucks at an idea on a whim. So to no one's shock, these companies didn't put forth their best efforts. And I'm sure that all of them had other plates spinning. They weren't going to commit hard to this venture when they had their own VoIP products they were trying to get off the ground. And it wasn't their job to. This was Microsoft's baby. It was their business to put Response Point's best foot forward, but they didn't bother controlling anything, so that didn't happen. I mean, I don't have the Response Point specs. I don't know what these companies were given as far as instructions, but it's pretty clear that Microsoft placed no requirements on the hardware at all. I mean, if we just look at these two base units and compare their design, it's pretty obvious that Microsoft didn't give them any guidance whatsoever in what they should be building. For instance, the Syspine is absolutely enormous. It's like the size of an original Xbox, and it kind of has, the 360 design language going on, with the white and the gray. And a lot of other Microsoft hardware sort of had these colors, so you might think that they gave them a palette to work with. But then you look at the AAstra, and it's just silver paint, black plastic. It's the most boring thing you've ever seen in your life. The D-Link product, on the other hand, at least from pictures, I've never been able to actually find one, looks much smaller, and it's designed more like a desktop KVM switch from like 2004. So completely different vibes to their whole industrial design, but that is just aesthetics, right? Let's talk about function. The AAstra and the D-Link have no local interface whatsoever because, of course, as I showed you, Response Point is meant to be used solely over your network. So why then does the Syspine have a local interface? I'm sure Microsoft didn't give any specifications for that, and indeed, I don't think Quanta knew what to do with it. If we plug this thing in, all right, we get this start booting message. And in my experience, 9 times out of 10, this will just sit there. It'll never get off the start booting message. But when it does, it just switches to like system ready. And that's the only message that it will ever appear on this panel. It doesn't do anything else. It doesn't tell you whether calls are in progress. It doesn't tell you if there's a network service interruption. It says absolutely nothing once this thing is booted. Yeah, so this is actually passing calls right now, but all it'll say is start booting. And you see all these controls over here, you think, oh, cool, I'll be able to do like diagnostics without having to get into the administrator app. No, none of this does anything. I think if you press IP, sometimes it'll show you the thing's IP address. Yeah, but I think you have to get to the system ready part before it'll do that. So whatever microcontroller on here is handling the screen is failing to communicate reliably with the software running on it. And the fact that it happens like 9 out of 10 times means that there's some race condition that's governed by how warm the thing is, or who knows what. And the only other feature here is this reset button, which simply doesn't do what it says it does. What this actually supposedly does is shut down the system. And to do that, you have to press and hold it. And after 5 seconds, the screen will say, unplug power cord. Here's the problem. I am 100% positive that this isn't actually talking to the underlying system, that this is just the microcontroller driving the screen that's been hard-coded to display this message after 5 seconds, because naturally, this is a PC running Windows XP and there's no way it could have shut down in 5 seconds. And we'll come back to that point, but anyway, this screen appears to be fake. It appears to be a decoy, either something they intended to do more with later, or, and I think this is far more likely, this is something that they made for some other purpose. They invested the R&D in this thing to make their own PBX, and then they did a really half-assed job of making it run Response Point. I mean, there's no way they would have put in this much effort just for Microsoft's weird half-assed project that was obviously not going anywhere. If you're wondering what I'm talking about, have you noticed this button next to the screen? This is a release that allows you to take the entire screen out and flip it over and reinstall it, because it actually connects to the PCB with pogo pins, and it has 2 identical sets of pads. So we can now put this back in like that. Now, why would you do that? Because this machine can be installed in 2 different configurations. You can either just put it on a shelf or a desk, or You can put it on a wall using these teardrop hangers on the back, but obviously you wouldn't want the screen at the bottom, so you'd have to flip it over to do that, and then the screen would be upside down. So they added this neat mechanism so you can flip the screen over. That's absolutely amazing and absurdly over-engineered, especially for a product that wasn't their baby. So that's why we know they didn't do this for Microsoft. Now, going back to the PC part, if we take a look at the back of this thing, it sure doesn't look like a PC, because we don't have any of the usual ports. There's a couple USBs, but otherwise we just have LAN, we've got audio for the music on hold, and then we've got the analog line modules. Oh, and I have to mention the USB ports. They're fascinating. Those are how you factory reset the device. There's no pinhole on here, nothing like that. There's no option in the admin software to reset the device. If you lose the password or something like that, you have to get the original CD and copy an exe off of it onto a flash drive. Then you insert it, you reboot the thing, and you just wait a long time, because there's no way to tell if it executed it or not. And then once you think that maybe it worked, you unplug the drive and then try to reconnect. Very, very professional. The same thing if you just want to reset the password. There's another exe that's just called like reset response point password. You put it in here, you just wait for a long time, and naturally both of these are lost forever, so I don't even know if they work at all. Anyway, the point is, it's oversized, it's overwrought, it's over-engineered, and it's obviously not for this purpose, but it is clearly an appliance. Now let's look at the AAstra. Okay, on the front, we've got, well, it kind of looks like a crappy DVR or like a Pentium 3 small form factor PC, and that's pretty much what it is, because, yeah, that's obviously just a PC, and one that wasn't customized for this purpose at all. We've got a PS2 keyboard and mouse ports. We've got a local VGA interface, way too many USBs. It's got a headphone jack. Why would you need a headphone jack on a PBX? Because this isn't meant to be a PBX. I'm sure they just bought this from some ODM that was selling it as a generic set-top box or whatever. And indeed, if we open it up, we find exactly what you'd expect from that. This comes apart with a single screw. The Syspine, by the way, goes to great lengths to hide every single fastener on the whole device. They're all either under feet, there's some hidden under here. It's really designed to look seamless. This is designed to be a computer. This is a pretty typical little guy. We've got a stick of DDR2 here. We've got a disk-on module over here. That's the hard drive. There's actually a normal front panel header over here. We've got USB headers. There's a via south bridge. I'm sure there's a north bridge under this heatsink. And under that heatsink, we've got a via Eden CPU. It's a very common chip for embedded applications before the Intel Atom came along. But what we have more than anything is an awful lot of empty space. There's just really nothing in here. And, you know, based on what we can see of D-Link's offering, that's probably just an off-the-shelf mini ITX board in a plastic box. So, to no one's surprise, all these things are just generic PCs, cheap designs that nobody cared about. The most interesting one is definitely the Syspine, but I'll leave that for a follow-up video because it's honestly so weird inside that I want to spend a bit more time on it. The point is, though, being PCs with Microsoft software, it is not shocking at all that these run Windows XP. Each one of these has a COA on the bottom, and it may say Microsoft Response Point, but come on, you know that's just Windows XP. And if you don't believe me, let's just fire the thing up. I mean, it has a VGA port. All right, we got our keyboard and mouse. Click. All right, here's our award BIOS. And there's Windows XP. Boots incredibly fast. I've never seen any copy of Windows start up this quickly. It's like 3 seconds. And sure enough, it's just a copy of XP Embedded. It's not even Service Pack 3. I don't think that was out yet. At any rate, they have put absolutely nothing in the desktop or in the start menu. It's actually the most bare bones copy of Windows I've ever seen. Check this out. That's it. There's literally no programs. And there's no indication anywhere that this is an appliance. You can't tell that it's running any special software. There's not even anything in the sys tray other than a driver for the built-in sound card. Oh, and another one for the graphics, you know, whatever. In fact, the only way to find out that this isn't just a blank, freshly installed copy of Windows is to go into the control panel, right Right, I forgot. They removed all those too. You have to manually go to the services control panel, and then if you scroll down, there's a handful of services for Response Point. This is the entire local presence of the Response Point software, which of course makes sense. I'm sure Microsoft didn't expect anyone to expose the local desktop. Why would they? This is clearly meant to be a headless product. But of course, none of the vendors were paying attention. They were all asleep, so they just left the VGA port on there and whatnot. So users probably plugged these in when they got them and got very confused, thinking they'd been sent a machine that wasn't actually usable, not realizing that there's no local admin software. And about that, that's a huge miss on Microsoft's part. This is PC-based. You cannot make a PC that does not have a video card. Yes, I know you technically can. Shush. At the point this was made, it was virtually impossible to get one that didn't have built-in graphics. They should have leveraged that. They should have mandated a local console with the administrator software installed, so you don't need to run it on another machine if you don't want to. It would have cost them nothing. And I mean, what was their solution if this thing fails to get a DHCP address or something? What was their solution for diagnostics of any kind, given that these clearly weren't required to even have a fault light or a speaker to give you a beep code if something goes wrong? Response Point just feels completely unfinished. It feels like they didn't think through any of these problems. But really, honestly, even that is putting the cart before the horse. We need to be asking more fundamental questions about this, like, why do these exist at all? I don't mean Response Point PBXs, I mean the physical embodiment thereof. These little plastic boxes, what do they achieve? There's no specialized hardware in this thing. I mean, yes, the Syspine does have its little analog interface cards, but those were obviously optional because these guys in D-Link didn't bother, so they didn't have to either. In fact, I doubt Microsoft even asked them to. These are probably just those network-attached converters I talked about earlier, built into the box. Really, Quanta was just going above and beyond. And that means that per Microsoft specs, the Response Point base unit did not need to be anything other than an ordinary PC. So why isn't it one? I mean, obviously you require the special phones, they've got to have the big blue button, but Microsoft could have had those made by anyone. It would have cost them next to nothing given their economies of scale. The actual product that Microsoft delivered here, Response Point itself, is just a program that could be installed on any ordinary PC. And I admit, I really wanted to do this as a bit for the video, and I failed, but I'm pretty sure that's just because the software checks to see if it's running on XP embedded and whether it's using the enhanced write filter, and I don't have the chops to set those up. But I also happen to know that the write filter is a nice bonus that's completely unnecessary. It's basically a Windows embedded feature that allows you to ensure that critical system files can't be overwritten. It's a really neat feature. And there are tens of thousands of Windows-based PBXs that have survived just fine without it. In fact, one of the most common phone systems that I encountered in my career was 3CX, which was indeed a program you installed on Windows. That was it, just a program. You could put it on anything. It was sold for about a decade, and while it was always maligned by serious phone people, it was still used successfully by thousands of companies. I worked with a lot of them, and they liked it. It had its problems, but it sure did outperform Response Point, and it didn't require any special hardware. So this whole thing seems absurd. Microsoft obviously could have sold Response Point as a standalone product, and it would have made a lot more sense, but even that isn't asking the real question, which is, why did Microsoft make this at all? And the answer to that, I think, is the story of the whole product. They didn't want to make it, that's why it's so bad, and that's why it was canceled. I already pointed this out earlier, but Mr. Huang was, by all appearances, not passionate about phones, and he didn't make this because Microsoft wanted to become a phone company. He made it because he needed a product. The thing is, though, it's not that Microsoft was uninterested in being a phone company. They just already were. Way back at the beginning of this video, which had to have been 2 hours ago, I mentioned Microsoft had a thing called Office Communication Server. I didn't mention that that already existed in 2007 before this product came out. I did say, however, that it was much bigger in scope than Response Point, and that's the thing about Microsoft. They don't do small. When Redmond Magazine, a Microsoft-specific publication, wrote an article about Response Point's cancellation in 2010, they quoted a market research company, one that solely focuses on Microsoft products, I should add, who saw two big problems with it. First, it was in direct competition with Office Communications Server, which was a darling of the company, and it had far more proponents and contributed to the bottom line of multiple departments. So that was already never going to fly. But also, ResponsePoint was focused on small businesses, so it would have to have been a rip-roaring success, moving hundreds of thousands to millions of units to even show up on their balance sheet. Microsoft cut it because they already had the thing they wanted, the huge thing, the enterprise thing. Now, we could look at this and say, wow, maybe there shouldn't be businesses that are so big that even when they come up with a really good idea, they don't bother selling it if it won't make them billions in revenue, only hundreds of millions. That's true. That's ridiculous. But it's still not the real issue here. The real problem is that Microsoft was the wrong place to make this thing, even from a capitalist perspective. For all of Mr. Huang's blustering about creating a startup inside an enterprise, it didn't actually work, because enterprises don't want startup products. He would have been better off leaving and forming an actual startup. A PBX for the rest of us would have raked in capital in 2007. It was the perfect year. He had the perfect product. All it needed was a little polishing. But that couldn't happen at a company that barely even bothers patching something if it doesn't show a profit within 18 months. The truth is that ResponsePoint was dead on arrival, and I think they knew that and didn't care, because the only purpose of this in the first place was to make one person's resume look more impressive. And if I sound overly critical, if this video has been nothing but complaints, it's because in my job, I encountered a lot of people who were frustrated with their phone systems, and there was really no reason that they needed to be that confusing. I'm genuinely irritated that the best chance we ever had at getting a truly easy-to-use PBX died on the vine solely because of where it was invented. And after such a promising start, too. For all the shit I've been talking, there are things to admire about ResponsePoint, and I think I pointed them out. I have the feeling that someone who worked on this did care, did understand the problem space. It wasn't all just clueless computer people. The very idea of starting with a question and answer format, like who will answer calls, that's a stroke of genius that could have been the spark of an excellent design pattern. And initial reviews when it came out were very optimistic. They called it the easiest PBX on the market. They were hoping for a bright future. And so I wouldn't be surprised to learn that the whole thing is just unfinished, that it's basically a beta that they pushed out to market and intended to improve later, and then priorities shifted and nobody ever got to come back and add any of the missing bits. And I mean, that's literally not true. The service packs did add a bunch of features, but it's all stuff that should have been there on day one, like paging, T1 and PRI support, selectable hold music, a call log, and VoIP. As it turns out, the first release couldn't actually connect to a voice over IP gateway provider. They had to add that. At release, this supported analog phone lines and nothing else. Considering these machines cost over $2,400, that seems absurd, even given the state of the industry back then. And even after those updates, the product was still incredibly bare bones. ResponsePoint needed a lot more work to even get to usable, let alone good, and it was never going to get it at Microsoft. What a shame. Anyway, if you made it this far, I appreciate that. It's hard for me to talk about phone stuff without either getting way too detailed or letting years of frustration color my language. Hopefully I didn't do too much of either, but the state of the industry has always just irritated me, especially since I used to work in the middle, where I couldn't really fix either end of the problem. I'll give more details on that in future videos, I'm sure. They just need to be their own thing, because this topic just goes on and on and on. There's so much to cover. I just wanted to let this thing stand on its own. So, I hope you enjoyed this video. If so, and you're new to my channel, consider subscribing. I try to make videos at least this interesting as often as I can. If you want to find out when I upload new stuff, remember to turn on notifications, but if you really liked this and want to make sure I can keep making similar things, then consider supporting me on Patreon like these folks are doing. This is my full-time job, and my patrons are the only reason I can afford to buy these things or pay my rent or buy groceries. So, thank you all so much for making this possible, and everyone else, thanks for watching.